Let's talk about the moment most of us have had, standing in the garden center aisle, staring at a wall of premium bagged soil, trying to do the math in our heads, while our backs already ache just thinking about hauling it all home. Raised beds are supposed to make gardening easier, cleaner, more organized. But somewhere along the way, they turned into a quiet little money trap. Not because raised beds are bad, they're wonderful, but because filling them the recommended way can drain your budget faster than a leaky hose. Here's the simple math that catches people off guard. A standard 4x8 raised bed that's 1 foot deep needs about 32 cubic feet of material. That's roughly 16 2-cubic-foot bags. If each bag is in the $12 to $15 range, you can easily drop around $200 just to fill one bed. And that's before you've bought seed starts compost mulch or anything else that actually grows food. Want 2 beds? Double it. Want a deeper bed for better roots? You can end up spending the cost of a decent appliance just to bury something you won't even see. And here's the part that really stings. Most of what you pay for ends up sitting in the dead zone. A lot of common vegetables, lettuce, spinach, radishes, herbs do most of their work in the top 6 inches. Even crops we think of as deep-rooted like tomatoes and peppers often concentrate most feeding roots in the upper layer, where oxygen and nutrients are plentiful. So when you fill a foot-deep bed with all premium mix, the bottom half frequently becomes expensive storage space material that stays damp compacts over time and contributes far less to the harvest than you'd expect. On top of that, many bagged mixes are built for convenience and shipping, not for long-term soil life. They're often heavy on peat or coir, light on minerals, and designed to perform best when you keep feeding them with fertilizer. That doesn't mean they're useless. Plenty of gardeners grow good food with bagged soil. But it does mean the system nudges you toward repeat purchases, more bags, more boosters, more bottles every season. And for those of us who want a garden that gets richer and easier with age, that treadmill starts to feel less like gardening and more like paying rent. A raised bed should be an investment that pays you back in harvest, and peace of mind, not a yearly bill that keeps climbing. Now let's step back from the price tag for a moment, because the cost of bagged soil isn't only measured in dollars. It's measured in what gets taken from the earth to make those bags feel light, fluffy, and premium. And the biggest ingredient behind that soft, springy texture is often peat moss, something that sounds harmless until you understand where it comes from and how long it takes to form. Peat isn't just old plant material. It's a slow-built archive of life created in cold, wet bogs where mosses and plants decompose so slowly that the carbon stays locked away instead of returning to the air. Think of a bog like a natural pantry for the planet, storing carbon the way a root cellar stores potatoes. The trouble begins when we mine that pantry for garden convenience. When peatlands are drained and scraped, that stored carbon is exposed to oxygen, and the process that once preserved it starts releasing it. It's not an instant dramatic puff of smoke you can see, but over time it adds up more carbon back into the atmosphere, less of it safely held in the ground. And then there's the habitat piece. Bogs aren't empty wastelands. They're living systems home to specialized plants, birds, amphibians, and insects that rely on those wet conditions. Once you disturb a peatland, you don't just remove material, you rewrite the entire environment. Recovery is slow because these ecosystems are slow by nature. They don't bounce back like a mowed lawn. They rebuild in generations, not seasons. This is why you'll hear about restrictions and phase-outs in some places. The direction of travel is clear. Peat is being questioned more and more, not because gardeners are villains, but because we now understand the hidden footprint of what we buy. The good news is that we have alternatives, options that can be kinder to the earth and often better for our gardens in the long run. If you want the same lightness without leaning on peat, you can shift toward compost leaf. mold-aged bark fines, well-rotted manure, or quality local compost blends. Coconut coir is another common substitute, and while it isn't perfect, it can reduce reliance on peat in many mixes. Even better is building soil from what you already have: fallen leaves, prunings, kitchen scraps, and the kind of waste that nature has been recycling for free since the beginning. When you choose materials that come from your own yard or from nearby sources, you're not just saving money, you're shrinking the distance between your garden and the land that feeds it. And that's what a legacy garden really is. Not just something that produces food, but something that does it with respect for the world it's rooted in. All right, now we get to the good part, the aha moment, where everything you've been spending money on starts to look a little unnecessary. Hugelkultur is one of those old-world techniques that feels almost too simple to work, and yet it's exactly how nature has been building fertile soil long before any of us were buying bags and bottles. The word Hugelkultur comes from German, and it roughly translates to mound culture or hill culture. But don't let the name make it feel complicated. At its heart, Hugelkultur is just this: you build a garden bed the way a forest builds soil. Instead of starting with perfect, expensive dirt, you start with wood logs, branches, and natural debris, and you let time do what time does best. You stack layers of carbon-rich material like old logs and sticks, then add nitrogen-rich greens like grass clippings, kitchen scraps, or manure, and you finish with a top layer of soil and compost where your plants actually grow. If you've ever walked through the woods and noticed a fallen tree that's half sunken into the ground, soft, dark, damp, covered in mushrooms and moss, you've seen the system at work. That fallen tree becomes what gardeners call a nurse log. It holds water like a sponge, shelters microbes, and slowly turns into rich humus. Plants sprout along it because it's basically a long-lasting pantry of moisture and nutrients. Hugelkultur is you recreating that nurse log on purpose, right where you want your garden to thrive. Here's why it works so well. Wood is mostly carbon, and carbon is structure. As the wood breaks down, it creates pockets and channels that help the bed breathe. Those channels improve drainage when you get heavy rain, but they also help the bed hold moisture during dry spells. Over time, as the logs soften and decompose, they become a steady release source of organic matter, feeding fungi, bacteria, and all the invisible workers that make soil fertile. In other words, you stop managing dirt and start managing a living ecosystem. And for those of us in the 55-plus crowd, Hugelkultur has a special kind of appeal because it can be built to match our bodies, not fight them. Traditional gardening often asks us to bend, kneel, lug heavy bags, and water constantly in the heat. A Hugelkultur bed can be built higher, sometimes much higher, so you can harvest without folding yourself in half. You do the heavy work once at the start, then the system pays you back by reducing the ongoing grind. Another benefit that surprises people is how the bed behaves across seasons. When decomposition is active, it can create a gentle warmth effect, sometimes enough to help soil wake up earlier in spring compared to flat ground. It's not magic, and it depends on your climate and materials, but many gardeners notice earlier growth and stronger early season vigor. The best way to think of Hugelkultur is not as a raised bed hack, but as a long-term engine. You're building a slow, steady system that turns wood and yard waste into dark, living soil year after year. And once you understand that, you stop asking, "How much soil do I need to buy?" and start asking the better question, "What do I already have that nature can transform for me?" Let's make this practical, because the beauty of Hugelkultur is that it doesn't ask you to buy anything fancy. It asks you to look at what you already have: fallen branches after a storm, old logs tucked behind the shed, last year's leaf pile, even the messy corners of the yard you've been meaning to clean up. In a normal gardening world, all of that gets treated like trash that needs to be hauled away. In Hugelkultur, it becomes the foundation of a bed that feeds itself. The lasagna protocol is just a friendly way of saying, layer your materials the way nature layers a forest floor, big and slow, at the bottom finer and richer as you go up, finished with a clean planting zone on top. Your goal is to build a structure that won't collapse into a rodent resort, won't starve your plants of nitrogen in the first year, and will settle into a stable moisture-holding sponge over time. Step 1. The foundation logs and large wood. Start with your biggest pieces. If you're building a mound, lay logs directly on the ground. If you're filling a raised bed box, you can use wood for the bottom 30 to 50% of the depth. Bigger wood breaks down slower, which is what you want. Think long-term fuel, not kindling. Hardwoods like oak, maple, apple, and birch are excellent for durability. Softer woods can still work. They just break down faster and may settle more quickly. Avoid black walnut because it can inhibit plant growth for many crops. Avoid treated lumber because you don't want those chemicals in food soil. Cedar isn't toxic, but it tends to rot very slowly. Use it only if you're comfortable with a longer, slower decomposition timeline. If your logs are bone dry, soak them or water them well as you build. The sooner the wood becomes waterlogged, the sooner it acts like a sponge instead of a dry block. Step 2. The filter pack branches and twigs. Next, fill in gaps with smaller branches, sticks, and twigs. This layer is important because it prevents your big logs from leaving cavern-like air pockets. The bed should feel interlocked, like a loose but stable framework. Here's a key detail many people skip: push soil compost or finer organic material down into the openings as you go. You want contact between materials. Big empty pockets can invite voles and create uneven settling later. In areas where rodents are a chronic issue, some gardeners line the base of framed beds with hardware cloth before building one upfront step that can save headaches. Step 3. The nitrogen fuel, the greens. This is where the engine avoids its most common first-year problem: nitrogen hunger. Wood is carbon-heavy, and microbes breaking it down will pull nitrogen from the surrounding environment. If you don't supply extra nitrogen up front, your plants can look pale, stunted, or slow. So add a generous layer of nitrogen-rich material: fresh grass clippings, kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, comfrey leaves, or aged manure. If you have access to rabbit manure, it's especially useful because it's mild and breaks down well. Llama and alpaca manure are also excellent. The goal is not to create a smelly mess. It's to balance the carbon below with enough nitrogen to keep the top planting zone productive. Step 4. The planting zone, topsoil, and compost. Finally, cap the whole system with a clean growing layer, about 6 to 10 inches of quality topsoil blended with compost. This is the home your seedlings and transplants will live in while the layers below begin waking up. Water the bed deeply after building so the entire stack settles, then plant as you would normally, keeping in mind that year 1 is the startup year and year 2 is when many hugelkultur beds truly start showing their strength. Built this way, you're not just filling space, you're building a slow composting reactor, a moisture reservoir, and a long-term soil maker, all in one weekend using what used to be yard waste. One of the reasons hugelkultur has stuck around for generations is that it doesn't just sound good on paper. It tends to produce results that gardeners can feel with their hands and see with their eyes: beds that stay damp longer, plants that push through heat stress better, and soil that grows darker and richer each season instead of getting tired. And while every yard is different, there are a few patterns that show up again and again in the stories people share after they've tried it. First, let's talk about warmth, because this is often the surprise benefit that convinces people they're watching something more than just a compost pile under soil. In beds where decomposition is active, especially if the wood has some age to it, and the nitrogen layer is balanced, gardeners often notice the bed wakes up earlier in spring. The soil on top can feel slightly warmer to the touch, compared to surrounding ground, especially in the morning when everything else still holds winter's chill. That doesn't mean the bed becomes a heating pad, and the effect varies by climate, moisture, and materials. But even a modest warmth advantage can matter when you're trying to get tomatoes, peppers, or squash going without waiting for the rest of the yard to catch up. Then there's the drought piece, the one that makes people talk about Hugelkultur, the way they talk about a good cast iron skillet with the kind of loyalty that only comes from relief. The internal wood layer acts like a long-term sponge. When you water deeply or get a good rain, that wood absorbs moisture and holds it, where roots can access it later. In a conventional raised bed, filled entirely with light mix, water can drain through quickly or evaporate faster than you'd expect, especially in heat and wind. But with a wood core, many gardeners report that the lower zones stay damp longer, so the plant's root system has a deeper backup supply. Over a summer, that can translate into fewer panic watering days, less wilting, and a more forgiving bed when life gets busy. Cost savings show up here too, and they're often what gets people to try the method in the first place. A common comparison gardeners make is simple one-bed filled the store-bought way versus one bed built with wood and yard materials for the bottom half. The difference in out-of-pocket cost can be dramatic because you're replacing expensive bulk volume with free carbon that would otherwise be hauled away or burned. Even if you still choose to buy compost and topsoil for the planting zone, and you should because that's where performance matters most, you're buying far less than you would for a full-depth fill. And when you're building multiple beds, that gap becomes the difference between one bed this year and a whole garden. But success stories aren't just praise, they're also warnings, and those warnings are valuable. One of the most common lessons people learn the hard way is the difference between logs and chips. Wood chips have a huge surface area, which means microbes can attack them quickly, and that can intensify nitrogen drawdown in year one. If you build a base out of chips instead of larger wood, you may see weak growth unless you compensate heavily with nitrogen. Logs, on the other hand, break down slower and tend to behave more like long-term water storage and steady organic matter production, which is what most hugelkultur builders are aiming for. So when you hear these stories, warmer starts, less watering, lower cost, richer soil, don't think of them as guarantees. Think of them as consistent outcomes when the method is built with the right materials, balanced nitrogen, and realistic expectations for a startup year. That's how hugelkultur becomes not a gimmick, but a dependable system. Even the best garden systems have a learning curve, and hugelkultur is no exception. The good news is that most issues are predictable, easy to diagnose, and fixable without tearing everything apart. Think of it like breaking in a new pair of boots. There may be a few rough spots in the beginning, but once the system settles, it becomes one of the most comfortable ways to garden. Nitrogen hunger, the year one stall. This is the most common hiccup, and it usually shows up in the first season. Your plants may look pale, slow, or undersized. Leaves can yellow earlier than expected, and growth can feel stuck, especially on heavy feeders like corn, cabbage, or tomatoes. What's happening is simple microbes are working hard to break down the carbon-rich wood, and they need nitrogen to do it. If the nitrogen layer was too thin, or if you used too much small wood or chips, the microbes can borrow nitrogen from the planting zone. Fix, don't panic, and don't blame your seedlings. Add nitrogen gently and steadily. A light feeding with fish emulsion, diluted liquid fertilizer, compost tea, or a top dressing of aged manure can correct the issue quickly. If you want a low-effort biological approach, plant nitrogen-fixing crops, peas, beans, clover in year one, then rotate into heavier feeders in year two, once the bed stabilizes. The key is to treat year one as the startup phase, not the final verdict. Settling when the bed shrinks. Hugelkultur beds settle. That isn't failure, it's evidence the engine is working. As wood softens, collapses, and turns into humus, volume decreases. A mound can visibly drop over months, and over years, it can drop dramatically. In framed raised beds, the soil level may sink enough that you feel like you lost half your fill. Fix, top it off. Each spring, add a layer of compost leaf mold or good topsoil. You can treat this like a yearly ritual, a simple refresh that keeps the planting zone deep, soft, and productive. Over time, the bed becomes easier to manage, not harder. Moisture imbalance, too dry or too wet. In dry climates, fresh wood can behave like a sponge that hasn't fully soaked yet. That means you may need deeper watering early on until the wood becomes fully charged with moisture. In very wet climates or poorly drained sites, a bed can also hold too much water, especially if built in a low area. Fix for dryness, water deeply and less often, and consider covering the surface with a light mulch once plants are established. For excess moisture, build higher, incorporate more coarse woody material for structure, and avoid placing the bed in a drainage bowl. Hugelkultur usually improves drainage compared to flat ground, but placement still matters. Slugs and the war on slugs. A freshly built bed with lots of shade and thick straw mulch can become slug-friendly, especially in damp regions. Slugs love cool, protected hiding spots, and mulch can unintentionally provide that. Fix: if slugs are a recurring issue, go lighter on straw in the first season or switch to a thinner, less slug-harboring cover. Some gardeners prefer compost as a surface top dress instead of thick mulch. Also consider simple controls, hand-picking at dusk, shallow beer traps, or encouraging natural predators by keeping habitat balanced. Rodents, voles, mice, and unwanted tenants. Large air gaps and loose cavities can attract burrowers. This is more common in beds built with big logs and not enough packing material between them. Fix: the prevention step is best push soil/compost into gaps as you build, and in framed beds, consider lining the bottom with hardware cloth if rodents are common in your area. If you discover tunnels later, collapse and refill those pockets with soil and compost, then compact lightly. Friends, when you look at the choices in front of us, it really does come down to two paths. One path is the yearly routine, loading the cart with plastic-wrapped bags, paying more each season, hauling them home and hoping that this year the garden will finally feel easy. The other path is slower, older, and far more powerful, building a bed that behaves like a forest floor, one that turns what you already have into fertility, water storage, and long-term resilience. Hugelkultur isn't just about saving money, though it absolutely can. It's about stepping off the treadmill and building something that improves with time. It's about trading constant inputs for a system that feeds itself. Over the years, that buried wood becomes sponge, then humus, then a dark living foundation that holds moisture through heat, buffers plants through stress, and supports the invisible microbial life that makes a garden truly productive. And there's something quietly meaningful about that, especially in the season of life, where we start thinking more about what we leave behind. A Hugelkultur bed is a small legacy project. You build it once with intention, then it keeps giving less watering, less fertilizing, easier harvesting, richer soil each spring. More time with your hands in the garden and less time wrestling with hoses, bags, and receipts. Now, I'd love to hear from you on the porch. Have you ever buried wood in your garden branches, logs, old stumps, and what happened? What's the most you've spent filling a raised bed, and did it feel worth it? If your garden needed half the watering this summer, what would you do with that extra time? Drop your thoughts below and let's grow something better together.